Good afternoon and welcome to AEI. If everyone can settle in and take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us, both those of you who are in the room and those who are watching online for our annual Walter Berns Constitution Day lecture. My name is Rebecca Burgess, and I manage the program on American citizenship here at AEI, which is dedicated to strengthening the foundations of American freedom and self-government by deepening America's knowledge and attachment to those underlying principles that are necessary to keep the United States free, strong, and democratic. Our format today is quite simple. After introducing tonight's speaker, we will have a lecture followed by a brief question and answer session. Upon the conclusion, we will ask you to join us in continuing the conversation over wine and cheese, which will be right outside these doors. The best part, the funnest part. Today, the American nation marks 231 years since the signing of the U.S. Constitution, and the program on American citizenship marks the 7th Walter Berns Constitution Day lecture, so named in appreciation of the scholarly legacy and love of the Constitution of our late AEI colleague, Walter Berns. Our topic for this evening is Emancipating the Mind, Lincoln, the Founders, and Scientific Progress, and it will be delivered by Professor Diana Schaub. Dr. Schaub is a professor of political science at Loyola University Maryland and visiting professor at Harvard University. She serves as a member of the Hoover Institution's Task Force on the Virtues of a Free Society. Previously, she has been a postdoctoral fellow of the program on constitutional government at Harvard University and has taught at the program of Michigan Dearborn. From 2004 to 2009, she served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. She has also served as assistant editor of the National Interest. She continues to teach and write on a wide range of issues in political philosophy and American political thought. She has been a great friend to the program on American citizenship. Among her books, she has co-edited with Leon and Amy Cass what so proudly we hail America's story, soul in story, speech, and song. She is the 2001 recipient of the Richard Weaver Prize for Scholarly Letters. If you would, please join me in welcoming Diana Schaub to the podium.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to express to the folks at AEI, Rebecca Burgess and also Gary Schmidt, who unfortunately can't be here, what an honor it is to give the Walter Berns Lecture on Constitution Day. Irene, it's wonderful to see you. You know what an influence Walter had on me and innumerable others. The American founders, the U.S. Constitution, and Abraham Lincoln were dear to Walter Berns, as his entire career testified, and as I learned firsthand when I took an American political thought seminar with him way back in the early 1980s, when he visited for a semester at the University of Chicago. In Walter's honor, I will touch upon all three of his favorites, but on a topic I don't believe he addressed, namely the meaning and status of science and technology in our political order. Let me begin, as I believe Walter might have, by drawing a contrast between ourselves and the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta. Our regime is uniquely friendly to science, as can be seen from Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which grants Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Unlike us, Sparta didn't believe in promoting progress, scientific or otherwise. If a political community is already in the best of health, change can only mean decline. To stave off decline, Sparta disallowed the two great agents of change, trade and technology. Interestingly, this devotion to fixity also entailed hostility to the written word. Sparta's fundamental ordinance, called the Great Retra, which came direct from the Delphic Oracle, was that the laws should never be put in writing. Instead, through good discipline, Sparta aimed to write indelibly and incontestably on the human heart itself. The avoidance of the written word affected the spoken word also. We still call a terse, uninquisitive style of speech laconic, after Laconia, the region of the Peloponnese where Sparta was located. Most nations have been more welcoming of the written word, especially those whose revelation took the form of Holy Scripture. Still, even among the people of the book, it took an awfully long time for the innovation of a written constitution to appear. Ours, as we all know, was the first, although the idea certainly caught fire. Of the almost 200 nations in the world today, only the merest handful are without a codified constitution. It shouldn't be surprising that the world's first written constitution contains an explicit acknowledgement of progress as a human possibility. The progressive assumption is there not only with reference to science and technology, but politically as well. The preamble asserts that the Constitution aims to achieve a more perfect union and to promote the general welfare. Both phrases emphasize improvement. Indeed, the literal meaning of promote is to forward move. Likewise, the provision for constitutional amendments in Article 5 welcomes a search for further political improvement, and the provision for new states, Article 4, Section 3, encourages the country's enlargement. Bigger and better is the American way. Arguably, the greatest generator of newness is that clause I began with. Interestingly, this clause is not known as the Science Clause or the Progress Clause, but as the Patent and Copyright Clause, although neither the word patent nor copyright appears in the text. Here's the full sentence. The Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Of the 18 paragraphs in Section 8, each one specifying a power of Congress, this one is unique. All the other paragraphs simply state, without elaboration, what power is being granted. For instance, the power to borrow money or to establish post offices. The means for carrying into execution each of the enumerated powers is left to the legislature under the general guidance of the Necessary and Proper Clause. However, in the case of the power to promote the progress of science, the means to attain the object are spelled out. Issuing patents and copyrights seems to be the sole constitutional means by which the federal promotion of science can be pursued. Thus, what could have been a very far-ranging grant of power became instead a narrow one. Accordingly, we refer to the clause by its restricted means rather than its more expansive aim. It's the patent clause rather than the progress of science clause. According to Madison's records of the Constitutional Convention, the initial suggestions for this section of the Constitution detailed many other modes of promotion, such as offering research grants, prize money to inventors, as well as establishing public institutions of learning. All the suggestions were sent by unanimous vote to the Committee of Detail. We don't know anything about what happened there. All we know is that the final stripped-down wording was approved by the full body, unanimously and without discussion, during the last 2 weeks of the convention. It might be worth noting that the limits expressed in the clause flow in two directions, by which I mean that just as the promotion of science is limited to patents, the rationale for patents is limited to their public benefits. Patents, remember, were considerably more controversial than post offices. Patents began in England as monopoly privileges granted by the Crown to merchants who garnered royal favor. The drafters of the Constitution wanted to be clear that their reason for protecting the financial interests of authors and inventors was for the public purpose of promoting scientific progress. They were not providing a blanket congressional authorization to set up commercial monopolies or to allocate economic privileges, as the Crown had routinely and abusively done in eras past. And indeed, the Constitutional Convention rejected wording that would have granted Congress the power to charter corporations. There's one other unique feature of the Patent Clause. It refers to a right. It's the only instance in the original Constitution, the Constitution of 1787, where the word right is used. This right, which we now call an intellectual property right, is very different from the rights that would soon be acknowledged in the Decalogue of constitutional amendments. The Bill of Rights forbids Congress from abridging or violating fundamental rights, rights of conscience, speech, personal security. By contrast, intellectual property rights are left entirely subject to statutory determination. Benefiting from the commercialization of one's writings and discoveries is not, it seems, a natural right. In other words, it's not inalienable. It's rather a civilly granted privilege. It might be worth thinking about why this is so. I mean, certainly everyone has an inalienable right to think your own thoughts. However, once you publish them, the ideas expressed cease to be yours. They become the shared possession of all who comprehend them. The Pythagorean theorem doesn't belong to Pythagoras, and it never did. By nature, the realm of ideas is pure communism. What the copyright clause does is say that in hopes of encouraging more folks to think original thoughts, society will forego its claim for a certain amount of time and create instead an artificial right in the first thinker who commits to sharing. The notion of intellectual property rights is itself a human invention for the encouragement of human invention. Although limited in the ways that I've outlined, the patent clause is not inconsiderable. As Abraham Lincoln so vividly described in his lecture on discoveries and inventions, what the patent clause does is add the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. Fuel of interest to the fire of genius. That's a pretty combustible combination, and it's one that has certainly furthered the Promethean achievements of modern science and technology. The underlying assumptions of the patent provision are that scientific advance will redound to the public good, and that the public good can be achieved by rewarding private enterprise. Although the power to establish a national university or to award premiums for discoveries was dropped from the Constitution, some of the founders continued to press for wider state sponsorship of science, especially applied science. Alexander Hamilton, for instance, concluded in his 1791 Report on Manufactures, calling for a plan to establish a board of commissioners whose task would be to incentivize useful discoveries by proportionate rewards. Hamilton's boss, George Washington, believed that Congress could go beyond the self-interest-based appeal of patents. There is nothing which can better deserve your patronage, he told Congress in his first annual message, than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness. 8 years later, in his farewell to the nation, Washington again spoke of the structure of happiness, arguing that religion and morality are the great pillars of human happiness. How can religion and morality be fostered? According to Washington, through education. The first use of the imperative voice in the farewell address is a command to promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. Washington anticipates no conflict between religion and reason, between morality and enlightenment. John Adams, despite his great erudition, was not quite as sanguine about the happy cooperation of the intellectual and moral realms. Listen to his description of what really motivates the men of science and letters. Scholars learn the dead languages of antiquity as well as the living tongues of modern nations. They puzzle themselves and others with metaphysics and mathematics. They renounce their pleasures, neglect their exercises, destroy their health. For what? Is curiosity so strong? If Crusoe on his island had the Library of Alexandria and a certainty that he should never again see the face of man, would he ever open a volume? Perhaps he might, but it's very probable he would read but little. A sense of duty, a love of truth may no doubt have an influence on some minds, but the universal object and idol of men of letters is reputation. Cynical, perhaps, but hard to gainsay. The conclusion Adams draws is that the spread of enlightenment will heighten human vanity. The more knowledge is diffused, he says, the more the passions are extended and the more furious they grow. Adams would not be surprised that the technology of social media, which has made everyone and his brother into an author, has also given rise to phenomenon like vengeful trolling or cyberbullying, or even just the vanity-driven obsession with likes and shares and all the new metrics of reputation mongering. While Adams was, like Washington, a proponent of public schooling, he put the greatest weight on constitutional structure. Since rivalries were bound to increase with the increase of knowledge, the essence of a free government, Adams claimed, consists in an effectual control of rivalries. What he had in mind, of course, were mechanisms like the separation of powers and an ingenious system of checks and balances. One final note about Adams. He saw with prophetic clarity how science could turn into scientism. An ideologized science might become the purveyor of what Adams called the most disconsolate of all creeds, that men are but fireflies and that this all is without a father. He predicted that thoroughgoing materialism would be anti-human in its effects, justifying even genocide. If man as man is not an object of respect, then, he said, the extermination of a nation would be as innocent as the swallowing of mites on a morsel of cheese. The murderous rationalizations of Marxism and fascism were already glimpsed by Adams. He had a further worry that the natural human response to such atheistic doctrines would be a longing to return to religious belief, but of the worst, most superstitious, fanatical, and modernity-hating kind, a prediction that we perhaps see borne out in the rise of radical Islam. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson disagreed on many things, the promise and peril of science among them. Of all the founders, Jefferson came closest to succumbing to what Adams might have called the French temptation, expecting too much of reason and underestimating its all-too-human character. Jefferson was radically pro-science to the extent of asserting that the general spread of the light of science would demonstrate the truth of human rights. Despite his faith in the unbounded exercise of human reason, at other times, Jefferson insisted that the only firm basis for the liberties of a nation was a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God. More troubling than this waffling on the foundation of rights is the fact that Jefferson dabbled in the pseudoscience of his day. His speculations on the supposedly natural qualities or inequalities of the various races testified to the all-too-human character of his own self-exculpatory reasoning. And yet, as Lincoln said, all honor to Jefferson, not only for writing the Declaration, but also for his impressive promotion of education. While Washington pushed for a national university, Jefferson acted locally, and with greater success, founding the University of Virginia and setting its science-heavy curriculum, while also sketching plans for a taxpayer-funded system of primary and secondary schools. Believing strongly that ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe, Jefferson declined to seek what he called monopolies of invention for any of the many devices that he designed, although he did head up the government's first patent review board. Benjamin Franklin also declined to seek patents, and he was a veritable Vesuvius of discoveries and inventions. An internationally renowned scientist with an imagination both visionary and eminently practical, Franklin was a disciple of Francis Bacon, looking to science for the relief of man's estate, and fully expecting stunning advances in the power of men over matter. In a letter to fellow scientist Joseph Priestley, Franklin predicts victory over all diseases, not accepting even that of old age. The 74-year-old Franklin, the letter's written when he's 74, the 74-year-old Franklin fantasizes about conquering gravity so that men might attain absolute levity for the sake, he says, of easy transport. One of his own unsuccessful inventions involved a balloon that was to hoist him a few inches off the ground while a friend walked along with the gout-ridden Franklin blimp in tow. This image of Franklin floating just above the human scene is an apt one, since the levity Franklin aimed at was more than physical, it was philosophic. He had a kind of lightness of spirit or equanimity about the human situation. Although he signed on to the Baconian project, he remained alert to the dangers of scientific hubris. Thus, in that same letter to Priestley, he makes clear that he doesn't expect improvements in moral science, since it is unrealistic to think that men would cease to be wolves to one another. Franklin, like that other American original, Mark Twain, turned to humor to deflate the pretensions of believers of all sorts. He skewered the pro-science fanatics as readily as he did the religious enthusiasts. The spoofs and satires Franklin wrote almost always under one pseudonym or another, are designed to make us a little more modest, a little more charitable, and a lot more cheerful. That's my quick survey of the Constitution's take on science, supplemented with a few reflections of some of the leading founders. What I'd like to do in the time remaining is focus on Abraham Lincoln's lecture on discoveries and inventions, which I believe is the most sustained treatment by an American statesman of the meaning and dilemma of science. Before hazarding an interpretation, it must be pointed out that we unfortunately don't have the speech in its final form. What we have are two substantial portions, 8 to 10 pages each, which were long thought to be separate efforts. The first lecture on discoveries and inventions and the second lecture on discoveries and inventions. But they may in fact be parts of a larger whole. There's some evidence to that effect. We do know that versions of the speech were delivered multiple times over the 2-year period from 1858 to 1860, during a period of extremely heightened public passions. The speech was first presented a couple of months before Lincoln's House divided speech, which is the speech in which he accepted the Republican nomination for the Senate and sketched the contours of the coming crisis. It was presented again a handful of times after his electoral loss to Stephen Douglas in that Senate race. The other activity that kept Lincoln occupied during this time was the preparation of a book-length version of his already famous debates with Douglas. As we'll see, the very heart of the lecture on discoveries and inventions is a claim about the effect of the invention of the printing press on the affairs of mankind. The medium of print allows one, Lincoln says, to converse with the unborn at all distances of time and of space. Getting the Lincoln-Douglas debates into print meant that Lincoln's forensic victory, despite the electoral loss, his forensic victory over Douglas stood, in his words, a better chance of never being forgotten, whatever might befall the country, even if what happened was the continuation of the Democratic Party's dominance and the nationalization of slavery. Finally, Lincoln delivered the lecture one last time after his tremendous Cooper Union address, the speech that fortified his status as a presidential contender in 1860. So it was during this time of intense partisan involvement that Lincoln saw fit to work on what he called his Lecture on Man. Apparently, this was material that Americans needed to ponder in a wisdom-seeking spirit as the crisis of the House divided gathered steam. All right, enough preliminaries. The first lecture, which I take to be the opening section of the speech, presents a survey of technological advances as gleaned from the Bible. This is no ordinary account of human ingenuity. Let me quote from the beginning. All creation is a mine, and every man a miner. The whole earth and all within it, upon it, and round about it, including himself, are the infinitely various leads from which man, from the first, was to dig out his destiny. In the beginning, the mine was unopened, and the miners stood, naked and knowledgeless, upon it. Lincoln rewrites Genesis, presenting man not in a Garden of Eden, or even tossed out of the garden to be a tiller of the soil, but instead as a miner, a deep digger, engaged in an extractive, industrial process. The mining metaphor, which coincidentally was much used by Francis Bacon, suggests that truth is hidden and that nature, even our own nature, does not reveal itself without the application of labor. Lincoln admits that other animals labor too, since they provide themselves with homes and food, but human labor is unique, since man is the only animal who improves his workmanship. Human labor, we might say, is scientific, inquisitorial. Lincoln, however, doesn't use an abstract word like science or scientific. His language is more explanatory. He says that this improvement is accomplished by discoveries and inventions. And he gives a memorable illustration of the operation of these two operations. Man's first important discovery was the fact that he was naked. and his first invention was the fig leaf apron. From that beginning point, Lincoln traces the scriptural evidence of human industry and its results. He moves from clothing to iron to forms of transport, then agriculture, and finally various forces that can replace man's own muscular power, namely animal power, wind power, water power, and steam power. Lincoln quotes from and cites 23 Bible verses tracking such things as the first mention of thread or instruments of iron or chariots. He also references another dozen or so Bible passages without providing chapter and verse. His account draws exclusively from the Old Testament, other than a single closing passage from the New Testament. The only New Testament verse, 2 women shall be grinding at the mill, said to be the language of the Savior, is offered to prove that the water wheel was unknown in Bible times. The verse, found in both Matthew and Luke, refers to the rapture at the second coming of Christ, while the surrounding verses detail the time of tribulation at the end of days. Thus, the horizon of the first lecture stretches from the creation of the earth to its destruction. As this last instance more than indicates, this is an unorthodox way to employ the Bible. Now, perhaps a pious man turns to the good book on all occasions, just as a good American turns to Lincoln. But still, this is making the Bible serve a purpose that seems altogether alien to the text. Matthew 24 is about the weeping and gnashing of teeth and Christ's prophecy of his return in power and glory. It is not about when the knowledge of a hydropower was acquired. I think the natural question has to be, what the heck is Lincoln doing? I want to suggest that Lincoln is quite aware of what he is doing and that he has carefully selected these Bible verses in order to tell 2 stories simultaneously. The first is a story of technological progress, slow but perceptible. The other is a story of sin, slavery, and divine punishment. Each human invention that is mentioned, beginning with that fig leaf apron, is linked to a tale of disobedience, suffering, and punishment. Let me give another example. After telling of the invention of clothing in response to the discovery of nakedness, Lincoln says, "The Bible makes no other allusion to clothing before the flood. Soon after the deluge, Noah's 2 sons covered him with a garment. But of what material the garment was made is not mentioned." This, of course, is another story of nakedness and shame. Lincoln doesn't mention the 3rd son of Noah, Ham, who both saw and spoke of the nakedness of his father, and whose descendants were cursed with enslavement as a result. Well known to Lincoln and his audience was that this Bible story was a staple of pro-slavery apologetics, providing a supposed theological justification for African slavery. This is not the only allusion to slavery. Indeed, the entire assemblage of verses that Lincoln cites could be said to revolve around the sojourn of the Jews in Egypt. The 2 centuries of Hebrew enslavement, with obvious parallels to American slavery, forms the subtext of Lincoln's speech. I don't know whether to call Lincoln's method of 2-tiered composition esoteric or not. It seems to me that Lincoln very much wants his audience to perceive his double inquiry into technological progress on the one hand, and on the other, moral non-progress, as in the hard-heartedness of Pharaoh. Lincoln can assume, as we today cannot, considerable familiarity with these Bible stories, but he also provides chapter and verse for those who want to be miners of the written word, contrasting his text with the source text. When you follow his leads, you discover another dimension of man's destiny, a political dimension. Lincoln makes repeated reference to one nation, Egypt. The very last topic in the first lecture is steam power. Lincoln points out that the Egyptians understood the principle, for they had a steam-powered toy, the aeolipile. However, they never applied the principle of steam power to useful machinery. He doesn't say so, but one wonders whether in their pride and stubborn reliance on slave power, the Egyptians failed to pursue the liberating potential of technology. Certainly, Lincoln emphasizes that the ancient world relied on manpower and animal power to the neglect of the motive power of wind, water, and steam. Like Egypt, the American South was a slave power, neglectful of technology. Although beholden to the Massachusetts inventor Eli Whitney for the cotton gin, patented in 1794, the South was neither theoretically inclined nor mechanically minded. The Confederate Patent Office issued only 266 patents during the whole war, as against more than 16,000 issued by the Union. The North surely had a genius for invention, but invention by itself is morally ambiguous, as can be seen in the career of Eli Whitney. Whitney's quest for efficiency reinvigorated the moribund plantation economy of the early 1800s, giving us King Cotton. But that same Eli Whitney was a pioneer in developing standardized, interchangeable parts, which revolutionized industrial production in northern factories, particularly armories, thus playing a key role in the Union victory in the Civil War. It's as if the Civil War is a kind of competition between the two inventions of Eli Whitney. If it is the case that Lincoln gives us a history of technology through the Bible so that he can deliberately tell two stories at once, what does he hope to achieve thereby? Americans who had long believed that they were the new Israel might not welcome being told that they are really the new Egypt, with their black slaves in the role of the chosen people of God. Now, the radical abolitionists frequently invoked this unflattering biblical parallel, but Lincoln had done so explicitly only once at the close of his Dred Scott speech. In this lecture, the current one, he proceeds by indirection, avoiding vituperation, avoiding moral fervor, but dropping plenty of hints about God's punishment of Egypt. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The contrast between Lincoln's rhetoric and that of the abolitionists could not be more dramatic. The abolitionists loved to quote Isaiah, the prophet who pronounced judgment upon all the nations with lines of terrifying vividness. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened, and the people shall be as the fuel of the fire. No man shall spare his brother. Lincoln mentions Isaiah twice, but only to trace the first mention of ore and sails. His mode is the opposite of the moral harangue. It is oblique and evocative, inviting thoughtfulness and further examination. Again, for those who follow Lincoln's leads, the verses in Matthew 24 that immediately follow Lincoln's only New Testament quotation, those verses refer to a house divided. 2 women shall be grinding at the mill. The one shall be taken and the other left. Watch, therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. It's with that implied warning that Lincoln shifts to the second part of the lecture, where he focuses directly and unmetaphorically upon the United States. You have all heard of young America, he begins. He details how this personage, this most current youth, fares with respect to the specific arts, clothing, agriculture, and transportation that he had examined through Scripture in the first part of the address. Young America is a figure of consumerist luxury, wearing fabrics, enjoying delicacies brought from all over the globe. The Egyptian horses, drowned in the Red Sea during the Exodus, have been replaced by the iron horse, the railroad, panting and impatient to carry him everywhere in no time. Lincoln's tone has a satiric bite. Young America, it turns out, was a campaign slogan, a campaign slogan associated with Stephen Douglas, his great opponent. Lincoln's riff on Young America and Manifest Destiny, another slogan that belonged to the Democratic Party, becomes especially pointed when he alludes first to the Mexican War and then to American slavery. Here's what he says. Young America owns a large part of the world by right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it. As Plato had for the immortality of the soul, so young America has a pleasing hope, a fond desire, a longing after territory. He has great passion, a perfect rage for the new. He is anxious to fight for the liberation of enslaved nations and colonies, provided always they have land and have not any liking for his interference. That's the reference to the Mexican War. As for those who have no land and would be glad of help from any quarter, he considers they can afford to wait a few hundred years longer. That's the reference to American slavery. In knowledge, he is particularly rich. He knows all that can possibly be known and is the unquestioned inventor of manifest destiny. His horror is for all that is old, particularly old fogey. And if there be anything old which he can endure, it is only old whiskey and old tobacco. After taking this partisan swipe at young America's hubris and hypocrisy, Lincoln immediately moves to higher ground, inquiring whether young America does indeed have the advantage over old fogey, and if so, what the real difference, what the great difference really is. Lincoln conducts his own version of the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. He starts by returning to the mode of biblical exegesis, calling to the bar the first of all fogies, Father Adam. Examining that first of all inventions, the fig leaf apron, Lincoln shows that Adam had first to invent the art of invention, an art that depends on the prior habits of observation and reflection, habits that themselves depend on the faculty of speech. And speech, says Lincoln, does not appear to be an invention of man, but rather the direct gift of his creator. Even if it is a human invention, speech is only possible, says Lincoln, because of fixed biological features, like the capacities of the tongue in the utterance of articulate sounds. And he actually says, he sort of did this experiment. He tells you how many seconds it takes to count from 1 to 100 and how many distinct sounds occur during that period. So these fixed biological features, capacities that Lincoln declares absolutely wonderful. Illustrating his meaning about human communicativeness, Lincoln mischievously adds, "This reminds me of what I passed unnoticed before, that the very first invention was a joint operation, Eve having shared with Adam in the getting up of the apron. And indeed, judging from the fact that sewing has come down to our times as woman's work, it's very probable she took the leading part. He, perhaps, doing no more than to stand by and thread the needle." Lincoln repeatedly reminds his audience, an audience inclined towards chauvinism of both the male and national varieties, of the humbling things they might prefer to forget. Not only are human beings beholden to their natural endowment and their immediate fellows, including female fellows, but there are intergenerational debts as well. The current generation is the beneficiary of the advances made by these very old fogies of earlier times. Lincoln suggests a humility-inducing thought experiment. Suppose the art of writing, with all conception of it, were this day lost to the world. How long, think you, before even young America could get up the letter A with any adequate notion of using it to advantage? It's Lincoln's Obama-esque, "you didn't build that" moment. While he doesn't reduce the current generation to pygmies, standing on the shoulders of giants, he does stress our position as privileged and rather complacent inheritors. Still, there is a modern difference. Improvements were achingly slow until the invention of printing, which Lincoln calls the other half and in real utility the better half of writing. Printing expands the field for invention, including political inventions like our Constitution, because printing awakens in human beings the thought of rising to equality. Printing is the Emancipation Proclamation of the mind. The final section of the speech pursues this question of modern superiority. Lincoln adds two more modern achievements: the discovery of America and the introduction of the patent laws, both of which have played a role in vastly accelerating the rate of discovery and invention. In the midst of this genuinely appreciative account, Lincoln stops suddenly and says, "Though not apposite to my present purpose, it is but justice to the fruitfulness of that period to mention two other important events: the Lutheran Reformation in 1517, and, still earlier, the invention of Negroes, or of the present mode of using them, in 1434. Once again, the oddity of Lincoln's procedure is striking. He just drops in that ironical phrase, the invention of Negroes, and then resumes his appreciative consideration of printing. What are we to think now of the contrast between ancients and moderns? In the first lecture, we learned of the slave-holding Egyptians who never realized the power of steam. In the second lecture, we get the full steam ahead Americans who really have unleashed the intellects and energies of man, and yet have also contrived to turn other men into inventions. Lincoln has mentioned 5 modern events. Together, these 5 events provide a genealogy of the crisis of the house divided. The 2 seminal inventions of modernity presage the conflict. The invention of printing in 1436 pointed humanity towards freedom. The invention of Negroes in 1434 created a new, more virulent form of slavery. The discovery of America, 1492, provided the ground on which both forces, freedom and slavery, eventually converged. The Reformation in 1517 added religious support for the cause of political liberty. Patent law in 1624, like the discovery of America, is ambiguous or double-edged. If the Negro is an invention, then that invention can presumably be patented, which is essentially what happened when the Royal African Company was granted exclusive rights to the slave trade in the 17th century. Or what happened when the cotton gin was invented and the southern states were refounded on what Lincoln, in his 6th debate with Douglas, called the cotton gin basis. We might with justice say that Lincoln's entire public career was devoted to disinventing the Negro, or disinventing the present mode of using him. He sought to move the Negro from his status as an invention to his rightful status as a human being. Clearly, not every invention advances civilization. Lincoln concludes his speech by returning to the one invention he considers most efficacious for good, namely the printing press. He credits a technological advance with breaking the slavery of the mind. Slavery has been present throughout the speech, first by implication through the references to Pharaoh in Egypt, Moses, and the children of Israel, then through the reference to enslaved nations and colonies, in the denunciation of American expansionism, and finally in that mordant line about the invention of Negroes. Now, at the very end of the speech, Lincoln shows that there is another aspect of slavery, an internal or spiritual aspect. He unearths the deepest cause of slavery, which turns out not to be political oppression, but rather ignorance. Ignorance of one's human nature. Before the print revolution, the great mass of men were utterly unconscious, says Lincoln, that their conditions or their minds were capable of improvement. They not only looked upon the educated few as superior beings, but they supposed themselves to be naturally incapable of rising to equality. To emancipate the mind from this false and underestimate of itself is the great task which printing came into the world to perform. And yet, Lincoln indicates technology by itself is insufficient, since it only supplies the means of reading. The existence of printed matter doesn't guarantee literacy. For that, you need teachers. And teachers, Lincoln laments, have not been very numerous or very competent. We are back at the one piece of advice that the founders and Lincoln agreed on. America is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, but it is only through education, and a certain kind of education, that individuals actually become capable of rising to equality. Of course, we need training in the STEM fields, and yes, our regime is uniquely open to science, but we should not forget that applied science can underwrite slavery almost as easily as it can undergird liberty. We need civic education and liberal education, education that reminds Americans of the great difference between self-aggrandizement and self-government, between mastery of self and mastery over others, education that promotes not only science and useful arts, but wisdom, Lincolnian wisdom.
Thank you so much, Diana, for those very enlightening remarks. If you will take a few questions.
Sure.
We have a few microphones that will be wandering around the room. Please wait until a microphone comes to you, identify yourself, and as we so often say, please ask a question. Please do not give us your comments. A question. So, questions? Front of the room?
Aben?
Hi, Abe Shulsky, Hudson Institute. Oh, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I'm very anxious now to pour over the talks that you mentioned because I wasn't familiar with them. But I was just wondering, one point that didn't come up in this history was that the question of whether Lincoln saw science and modern technology as what in fact made it possible to do without slavery, because I mean, you mentioned the slavery in Egypt, but of course there was slavery in the ancient world generally. I mean, it was taken in a sense for granted that it would be necessary, and the modern technology implies that no, you don't. I mean, you can have a high standard of living for people without that kind of institution. So I was just wondering, did he talk about that connection between technology as the thing that makes it possible to do without?
Yeah, I mean, not really, because I think the real message of the piece is so embedded and it has to be pulled out of it, so there's no explicit treatment of that. Although I do think he was suggesting something about the Egyptians, that because they didn't really pursue technology, that never occurred to them. But it's not as if the South is escaping the fate of becoming Egypt. So, in other words, the real problem is a moral problem and not a technology problem. But I mean, I do think you might be right. We have the luxury of being able to spread freedom. And what he says about printing makes that very clear. Right? Equality becomes a real possibility in the modern world. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Schaub. Wesley Jeffries, New America Foundation. A running theme in your lecture is nakedness and shame covered up by the invention of clothing. Can we discern from this some lesson about our modern predicament? Do we use technology, invention, progress to sort of cover up our own moral ignorance, shame, or the nakedness of our soul?
Well, there's a big question. Yeah, but I mean, one thing that's interesting about what Lincoln does is that he doesn't quite give the treatment of these questions that the Bible gives. And so he seems to be, I mean, that's what I was suggesting by that image that he uses of being a miner rather than the Garden of Eden story. I think he is more receptive to science and technology than the Bible is. And one thing that's interesting is that he doesn't include the story of the making of bricks and the building of the Tower of Babel. That is left out. And I think that must have been pretty deliberate on his part. He maybe doesn't want to include that story because that seems an indication that God is not so in favor of technology, and Lincoln's speech is all about communicativeness and speech and writing and print. And here in the Tower of Babel story, we have God, scattering the nations and depriving us of one language. So. Yes, hard to know actually what he's saying about that deepest kind of shame that you're talking about. I mean, he is somehow chastising the nation. He wants to, chastise us for our hubris, but I'm not quite sure he goes as far as the Bible does.
Thank you. Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute. First of all, just thank you, Diana, for just a wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm wondering what his contemporaries made of this speech.
Oh, the speech was a disaster. Yeah, I mean, and when you read it, I mean, it is weird. It's truly weird. And so it was not a success at the time. He gave it a handful of times, but the audience kept getting smaller, and one time it had to be canceled because the audience wasn't large enough. And when you read it now, the only part of the speech that's in a way really successful is that attack on young America. But of course that was an attack. A satiric attack on many members of the audience. Illinois was, the Democrats, we lost the election, right, in Illinois. So he was speaking in a Democratic stronghold. And scholarly opinion has not been any kinder to it. Even Richard Brookhiser, whom I think very highly of, he's got that wonderful series of biographies of various founding figures, and he says that here Lincoln's history just descended into trivia and whimsy. So it's a very unusual speech. It's also very hard to be confident that one's reading of it is on the mark because of the two parts. But we do know that Lincoln took this seriously when he left Springfield to assume the presidency. He taped the two manuscripts together and entrusted it to the safekeeping of a friend. We also know that very late, 1864, early 1865, in an interview with a noted scientist of the day, he expressed an interest after he got out of this place, right? In other words, after his second term had ended, he expressed an interest in resuming that speech and putting it into final form. So and he did describe it as his lecture on man. So I think it is worth, really paying some attention to and trying to figure out what he was up to.
You mentioned in passing his dedication to having the text of the debates published, whether or not they had any impact in the near term, that they would be for posterity.
I don't think so much in the near term. He really was, that line about print enabling you to speak to the unborn in the future. He really was not certain what was going to happen. Remember the analysis that he gives in the House divided speech. If this Democratic dynasty remains in control, we will see a second Dred Scott decision, and that second Dred Scott decision will nationalize slavery. So,
Thank you. It really was a great talk, raising lots of far-reaching questions. But I have one very specific thing I want to ask you about. What you referred to as or what Lincoln referred to, I guess, as the invention of the Negro. And dated to 1434.
1434.
That didn't register with my small store of historical knowledge. I wonder if you could say a little bit what he was referring to.
This took a little bit of research, too. The date that Lincoln gives for the invention of Negroes is the date when Portuguese explorers first rounded the treacherous Cape Bojador on the western coast of Africa. It was a feat of navigational expertise and daring that led almost immediately to the start of the African slave trade. So that discovery, that invention, that achievement, right, immediately led to the opening of the African slave trade. I found some really neat stuff about Cape Bojador. It required. It still is treacherous to this day. There are wrecks all the time there. You cannot sail close to the coast there. You have to be willing to go out into the open sea in order to get around it because of some particular features about the depth and the way the winds change at that point. And
we have time for one last question.
Thank you, Dr. Schaub. My name is Greg Scheckman. I'm with the University of Central Florida. Your talk was exquisite. It was really delightful. So the one thing I thought you missed when you were talking about science and Lincoln is he actually signed the charter to create the National Academy of Science.
Yes, that's
so
right.
He had a lot to say about it. But the question I have for you was when you were talking about how prescriptive the framers were about promoting science and useful arts being limited to patents and copyright, does that mean that a strict interpretation of the Constitution would say that, for example, federal funding of research might be going too far?
A good question. Probably not a debate that you're going to win if you take that position, that all of this stuff that the government is doing with respect to science is unconstitutional. I'm sorry, I swallowed that water a little bit wrong. That was Jefferson's view, though. He wanted to do more to sponsor science, but he thought a constitutional amendment would be required to do it. Other founders were willing to take or to try to do more state sponsorship of science without a constitutional amendment, including Washington. So he called for the founding of a national university repeatedly. And the next 5 presidents, up through John Quincy Adams, all made the same request of Congress. Congress failed to act on it.
Thank you so much, Diana. If you would all, thank you all for joining us. And please feel free to join us in our reception right outside. Thank you.